In this video, we're going to talk about the 5 ways to define color in CSS. The first one you've already seen, at least if you've watched the previous video. That's keywords, things like black or white, or teal or orange. Just very simple names that describe the color that they're creating. There's a limited list of those, which we'll see in just a moment. We also have hex or hexadecimal, which there's an example here of CC3300. And then a short hexadecimal version, you can shove things down, basically, under certain circumstances. And we also have RGB decimal notation. For RGB values, you have the RGB with parentheses, and then inside those parentheses, you put the actual color values you want. In this case, for decimal, 204, 51, 0. Or if you're going to use percentages, use something like 80%, 20%, 0%. Let's look at the keywords just for a moment. There's a list of 17 keywords in CSS 2.1. Previous to CSS 2.1, there was actually a list of 16, but 2.1 added orange. So sometimes we refer to CSS 2.1 as CSS, now with orange. You can see here in this image that we took from the CSS 2.1 specification, these are the 17 named colors, and they're hexadecimal equivalents. Any browser that claims to be CSS conformant has to be able to deal with these color names. Now, as you can see, these have hexadecimal equivalents. For example, red is FF0000, which basically means all the red you can give me and no green and no blue. White, all Fs. Black, all zeros. The keywords are great if you just need one of those 17 colors and have no need for any more precise color than that, but you probably will need more precise color than that. As an example, something that you might pick out of a color picker like the one we see here from Adobe Photoshop. You can see right near the bottom of the dialog box, sort of to the right of center, there's a hexadecimal value right there, CC3300. That describes this particular color that's showing up in the preview box. And right above that hexadecimal value, there's a RGB of 204, 51, and 0. Those are decimal RGB numbers. So this particular shade of orangish red, CC3300, or 204, 51, 0, those are two different ways of expressing exactly the same color. Now, the other stuff here, you see the HSB, the LAB, the CMYK. Those are things that Photoshop lets you do. You can't specify CSS colors using HSB, LAB, or CMYK notation. At least not yet. Maybe one day, but not right now. So let's go back to our list of keywords, and there's our CC3300. In hexadecimal notation, each pair of digits describes the given color level. So the first 2 digits, CC, that's a 2-digit hexadecimal number that describes how much red there's going to be. And that's on a scale of 00 to FF. Hexadecimal being in a counting system that goes from 0 to F and then starts over. So the 3 is that level of green, and then 00 is that level of blue, which would be none. So in hexadecimal, all white is all Fs, and all black is all zeros. CSS offers a short hexadecimal notation where if you have a value that consists of 2 repeating pairs, like CC3300, you can shorten it down to just C30. Now, if we had CA3701, there's no way to take that down to the short hexadecimal notation. Only if you have these explicit pairs, because when a browser sees C30, it says, oh, okay, I have to expand this to CC3300. Now, is one better than the other to use? Only if you like one better than the other. From a browser point of view, from a results point of view, these are functionally equivalent. C30 will give you exactly the same color that CC3300 does. So it really comes down to which one you prefer. If you would rather have colors written out even when they're repeating pairs, if you want them in the 6-digit notation, then that's fine. Do that. If you like to compress them down to the short hex, then go for it. Now, I said that the hexadecimal pairs go in the range of 00 to FF. That's equivalent to the decimal range 0 to 255, which is why the RGB decimal notation uses that range. White in RGB decimal is 255, 255, 255. Black is 000. So the equivalent of CC3300 is 204, 51, 0, just like we saw on our Photoshop color picker, CC3300, 204, 51, 0. Hexadecimal value CC is exactly equivalent to the decimal value 204. 33 in hexadecimal is 51 in decimal. So that's where RGB decimal comes from. It's a base 10 decimal way of representing hexadecimal values, because not everyone can comfortably think in hexadecimal. It's strange but true. So RGB decimal is there to make things a little easier. And easier still is RGB percent, which an equivalent to our RGB 2045110 is an RGB of 80%, 20%, 0%. RGB percentages go in the range, as you might expect, 0% to 100%. White is all 100%. Black is all 0%, as we can see here. So how to get from RGB decimal to RGB percentage is to divide each of the decimal values by 255. So our 2045110, 204 divided by 255 is 0.8, which is 80%. 51 divided by 255 is 0.2, that's 20%. 0 divided by 255, of course, is 0, or 0%. There are many people who find it much easier to think in terms of color percentages than they do in terms of decimal values on the range 0 to 255 or hexadecimal on the range 00 to FF. The drawback is that because of the way browsers are, percentages are a little bit coarser. You should be, in theory, able to use decimal fractions with the RGB percent, things like 66.67% and 42.5%. But browsers don't always handle that very well. Some of them will round down those fractions, so 66.67% becomes 66%. There are others that do, or may in the future, round to the nearest whole number, so the 66.67% will become 67%. So you get these slight differences in colors possibly between browsers if you use percentage fractions. So if you prefer to use percentages, that's great. By all means do so. If you prefer to use the RGB decimals because they're a little bit more precise, instead of basically 100 points from 0 to 100, you have 255 points from 0 to 255. You could do that, or hexadecimal, whatever you like. In a lot of cases, honestly, you're probably going to pick a color with a color picker or on a color wheel of some kind. Once you find the color values that you want, you can get them out of your program if you're using Photoshop, or if you're sampling colors off of images, whatever it is that you're doing. Your tool will tell you, and probably in one of several ways, what those color values are. You could probably get a 6-digit hexadecimal value out of it, or RGBs from 0 to 255, or even percentages. So, you can mix them up in your style sheet however you want to do them. There's no one that's objectively better than another. It's really just what makes you the most comfortable and, as I say, what your tools yield for you. If you use the Photoshop color picker, it's got that little 6-digit hex box right at the bottom. You can just select it and copy it and paste it into your style sheet, and there you go. But however you do it, not only can you apply these colors to text, as we saw in the previous video, but also to backgrounds of elements, as we'll see in the next video.